Good evening. Good evening. Hello, everybody. My name is Negaya Chorley. I'm the CEO of Results International Australia, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to this important discussion tonight. Not only do we have all of you here in Sydney with us, but also a group of leaders from academia, international development, and the media from around Australia and around the world, watching live and online. A very warm welcome to each of you. Firstly, some housekeeping. Can you please turn your phones onto silent? We wanted you all to know that bathrooms are located to the left of the lifts where you came in this evening. Drinks and canapes will be served in the foyer. And in the case of an emergency, which will not happen, but please follow instructions. Let's now turn our hearts and minds to acknowledgement of country. Welcome to those that have just joined us. Please feel free to find a seat if you can. So tonight we're going to hear from global changemakers Professor Gareth Evans AC QC, Thenu Herath, and Dominic Dwyer, who will outline how Australia can be a good international citizen. This will be a really important conversation between elder statesmen and some emerging young leaders on our country's role in tackling some of the defining issues of our time. Given the rising impacts of climate change, global poverty, and of course, particularly the impacts on women and girls, and of course, we're seeing all around the world rising geopolitical tension, this conversation could not be more important nor more timely. We're also going to recognise the good international citizens in our midst by delivering our annual Results International Leadership Awards, which recognise individuals, corporations, and political leaders who have made outstanding contributions in eliminating global poverty. It is now my absolute pleasure to introduce Nicole Clements, who will lead the panel discussion. Nicole is a former SBS and ABC journalist, an international development specialist, and an executive with the hugely impressive microcredit organisation Opportunity International Australia. I'll invite you and panellists up. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you, Negaya, and I would now like to formally introduce this distinguished and inspirational panel. Firstly, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Gareth Evans AC QC. A barrister and academic by training, Professor Evans entered the Federal Parliament in 1978 as a senator for Victoria. In the Hawke government, he served in a number of key cabinet ministries, and of course, in 1988, he was appointed Foreign Minister, and he went on to become one of our longest-serving and finest foreign ministers. After leaving politics, Gareth has had an enormously busy and distinguished life. He was president and CEO of the International Crisis Group. He was co-chair of both the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty and the Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. And he served as Chancellor of the ANU from 2010 to 2020. Secondly, thrilled to welcome Thenu Herath. Alongside her role as CEO of Oaktree, Thenu is currently completing her Juris Doctor at the University of Melbourne and working with the World Economic Forum's Global Shaper community. She is on the Global Executive Committee of the Commonwealth Youth, Human Rights and Democracy Network. In 2022, Thenu was awarded the Rising Star Alumni Award by the University of Melbourne and named one of Australia's young women to watch in international affairs. Finally, it is my pleasure to introduce Dominic Dwyer. Dominic is completing a PhD on scholarship at the ANU, focused on the intersection of economic, political and strategic dynamics in Asia, has worked in Parliament and a think tank. He has written widely on international affairs and is the co-founder and executive director of the Youth National Security Strategy. So why these three people? Gareth Evans is with us today as he has written a very important book, Good International Citizenship, The Case for Decency. Don't laugh. Published by Monash University Publishing, it makes a compelling case to place decency right at the heart of our foreign affairs. At about the same time he wrote his book, a group of 42 young people from around Australia gathered to develop a youth national security strategy, a next-gen alternative vision for Australian security. Dominic was the co-founder and Thenu one of the leading contributors. This groundbreaking initiative does more than just assess the problems facing our country and the world. It provides a vision and a robust, workable policy agenda to deliver it. Given Professor Evans, Dominic and Thenu have spent considerable time and effort setting out their vision for our country and its role in building a more decent and sustainable world, and Results' commitment to elevating the voices of young people to influence public policy, well, we thought there would be value in bringing them together to have this vitally important conversation. So please welcome our three panellists. So let me start with you, Professor Evans. Can we begin by asking you to sketch the key idea of good international citizenship as a guiding concept for foreign policy?
Thanks very much, Nicole, and thanks for the opportunity to join this fantastic duo and to join all of you in this fascinating discussion. Being a good international citizen, essentially being seen to be a decent country, the kind of country that genuinely cares about poverty reduction, pandemics, catastrophe, conflict, atrocities occurring in faraway countries where there's very little prospect that doing so will in fact be rewarded for us in security terms or economic terms. Being a good international citizen is being the kind of country that other countries warm to, trust, want to emulate, and want to do that because they see you as the kind of country that is attractive and caring about these sorts of issues. Everyone gets it that foreign affairs, that any country's conduct of international relations has to be about national interests. And everybody gets it that the two big baskets of national interest are security, geostrategic security on the one hand, and economic prosperity on the other. It's a harder sell when it comes to this basket of what I call decency issues, aid and human rights and addressing, trying to engage in conflict prevention and response in faraway countries when there's no obvious return of an economic or security kind. But what I argue is that we really need to characterise our national interests in a broader spectrum. We need to think of national interest as being not just the pursuit of our security, not just the pursuit of our prosperity, but also the pursuit of essentially international decency. And I argue that that's not just a moral imperative, you can see the point of that, but it's also a national interest imperative, and I argue that there are some pretty substantial, hard-headed, realist returns for engaging in that kind of policy response.
Wonderful. You also argue that good international citizenship is a moral imperative and national interest imperative, but can you go into a bit more detail about why that is so important for most Australians?
Yeah, I mean, pretty obviously, behaving decently in all the spectrum of issues we'll maybe come to in a moment in more detail is something which we are or should feel morally compelled to do. Whatever one's approach to the foundations of your moral judgments are, whether they're secular or religiously based, humanistically based, or whatever particular cultural tradition you come from, there's a remarkable commonality when you look around the world at the way in which issues are ascribed with moral value and responses are seen to be moral responses. And somebody once put it, I mean, different approaches to identifying what's morally good are really just different ways of climbing up essentially the same mountain. And really, what's at the heart of just about every ethical or religious moral tradition is the idea of our common humanity, the essential decency, the essential dignity, and the demand that every individual, whatever their race, ethnicity, religion, caste, ideology, culture may be, the genuine need of everyone to be treated as an equal and given equal respect and equal dignity. So the idea of our common humanity is at the core of the moral imperative. So that's that. We all understand that. But the idea of good international citizenship as a national interest imperative depends on being able to satisfy the hard heads that there's more to it than warm inner glows. There's more to it than Boy Scout good deeds. There's more to it than missionary activity. Yeah. That there's something really that does generate quite hard returns. And I've certainly found the need to do that when I was trying to argue the case with my cabinet colleagues back all those years ago. Why should we spend more money on aid? Why should we spend more money on disaster relief or whatever it is when there's so many needs crying out at home? And I argued that there were three hard-headed returns. One was reputational. And it's pretty obvious when you think about it what that involves. Countries that are seen as decent countries are the kind of countries that others want to study in, travel to, invest in, trade with, and just deal with comfortably and productively on a whole bunch of international forums. And countries like, the Scandinavians traditionally, Canada traditionally, New Zealand traditionally, and Australia periodically have been in that category. It's what's called by some people soft power, the notion that power just doesn't mean the power that comes from a gun or that comes from economic might or muscle. Soft power is the reputational power that flows from being the kind of country that people do trust and emulate. So there's the reputational thing is important. The reciprocity dimension is important. It's a common human phenomenon that when you do something decent for other people that you're not compelled to do, but you're doing it because it's the right thing to do, the instinct to reciprocate is very strong. So if we help other countries on their issues, whether it's piracy or response to some natural disaster, catastrophe, or anything else, those countries will be that much more willing to help us when it comes to our preoccupation with drug or people trafficking or whatever our issue is. Ditto in terms of willingness to support us for positions in international bodies. The sort of thing that does actually matter if you're trying to advance Australia's interests in other more specific ways. So the reciprocity dimension is important. There's a third hard-headed return, which is just in terms of getting more things done. There's so many issues out there, in particular the big existential risk issues, pandemics, climate and nuclear weapons, which really do depend on collective action from a whole bunch of countries. That it's in everybody's interest that we solve these problems, but it's not in everyone's interest immediately in terms of the balance of benefit and harm. I mean, for example, Australia with the fossil fuel interest is at odds in many ways with our determination to, at least the new government, to make a contribution on climate change. So there's many issues like that where it's not an easy sell to do it in terms of a very hard-headed approach to what matters. But if you do bring to the international discussion and the presence a commitment to behaving decently on a whole range of issues, and in particular that cooperative mindset, cooperative problem-solving mindset, it just does make it that much easier to get agreement about these collective action problems that are so intractable. So there's a bunch of hard-headed reasons for doing this, not just the Boy Scout good deeds reasons.
Yeah, thank you so much for outlining that return on investment, really, I guess, for Australia. So what's the marking criteria? How do we judge whether a country is or is not being a good international citizen? And how does Australia rank?
Well, there's lots of different ways you could do this. My view is keep it simple, and I think there are four basic benchmarks that I regard as incredibly that determine it one way or the other. One is how generous an international aid donor you are. And here our record has been pretty lousy for far too long. the standard international benchmark is 0.7 of GNI, gross national income, 0.7%. Australia, the closest we've got to that is about 0.5% in the Whitlam period, and aspirationally during the Rudd-Gillard period, we're now down below 0.2%. And we are among the least generous of the rich country aid donors. So that's a crucial benchmark, and we have not done well. And the second benchmark is how you respond to human rights issues, universal human rights issues. It's not a matter of promoting Australian values, it's a matter of doing everything we possibly can to promote those universal values of equality, non-discrimination, free association, speech, and so on, and how well and confidently and competently and productively you advance that objective. A third benchmark, and on that, Australia's got a mixed record. We've periodically done pretty well, and on issues like the big campaign against apartheid, which Australia was very much an international leader of, in particular the issue of financial sanctions back in my period, and a number of other issues over the years. Of course, it also depends your credibility on international human rights issues, how well you perform domestically on human rights issues, because quite properly the whole world hates a hypocrite in that respect. And here again, Australia's reputation has been pretty mixed. It's gone up and down. We've done, reasonably well in recent years on racial issues, reasonably well on Indigenous issues with Rudd and Keating and so on, but overall it's been a pretty mixed record, and not one to be as proud of as arguably we should be. A third benchmark that really matters is doing the best you possibly can to help with conflict prevention and resolution, atrocity prevention and resolution, response, and also helping the victims of conflict and of mass atrocity crimes, genocide and ethnic cleansing and so on, which means refugee policy, asylum seekers policy and so on. Here, Australia's record again has been pretty mixed. We've done some pretty good things over the years. Cambodian peace settlement that I was much involved in is regarded as a high watermark in terms of what Australia can do as a creative, imaginative middle power on conflict prevention issues beyond our own shores. But our response on a lot of other issues, the East Timor issue and so on, has been much more problematic over the years. And of course our participation in the Gulf War in 2003, one of the least defensible wars ever to have been mounted, did not do our reputation a lot of good, any more than it did America's, or Tony Blair's, or a few other people. So our record is mixed on that. Our peacekeeping record is very much part of this. In the past, that's been a terrific record. We've had often thousands of peacekeepers in the field internationally, Cambodia and lots of other places. Now we're down to less than 50 personnel in, I think, 4 missions, and it's just a catastrophic abdication of responsibility. And on the question of helping the victims of conflict and mass atrocities, of course, our record on asylum seekers has been not a thing of beauty at all. The race to the bottom with both parties, my own party included, engaged in post-Tampa, which everyone can remember, has really been a matter of, I think, international shame for us. I think the present government is determined to try to redress the optics and the reality of that, but it's got a long way to go to recover ground, let me tell you. The final benchmark that I think is important is contribution to resolving the big existential risk issues, pandemics and climate change and nuclear weapons. This again is, as I said before, it's not an area where there's necessarily immediately obvious returns. There may be disbenefits for the country in being a heavy-duty participant in those policy exercises, but they're really, really crucial, and it's only through bringing a cooperative mindset and a willingness to do stuff that has to be done, even at the expense of immediate interest, is an important benchmark. And here again, the record is mixed. On pandemics, okay, pass, I guess, but only a bare pass. We haven't been very generous at all in our response to our Pacific neighbours' needs, Papua New Guinea and elsewhere. There's a lot more that can and should be done in that context. Climate, obviously, has been a policy catastrophe area for Australia, for reasons we can all remember and relate to. I think, again, we're seeing a turnaround of that at the moment, which is very important to our international credibility. Nuclear weapons, an issue in which I've been much involved in, is another area in which Australia has in the past punched a bit above our weight in terms of trying to develop a normative consensus internationally that nuclear weapons are not only the most indiscriminately inhumane weapons ever invented, but are useless as deterrents, and there's far too much idiotic confidence in them, and the risk of catastrophe from their use, whether deliberate or more likely non-deliberate, through just system error, human idiocy, has catastrophic potential. Australia has dipped a toe in those waters. We seem likely to do so again with the present government, but we haven't done nearly as much as we could in that context. So the record is mixed. Sometimes it's been good, sometimes it's been patchy, sometimes it's been lamentable. It hasn't been good the last 10 years on almost any of those fronts. I live in some hope that we will see a turnaround, but the jury is still out.
Well, thank you for that scorecard. And just one final question. In terms of domestic politics, you argue that good international citizenship has really, some concrete benefits. Can you spell the domestic politics side?
I've got a section at the end of this book called The Politics of Decency, which addresses the issue as to just how much political risk governments take by putting eggs into this decency basket, as distinct from pandering to more obvious domestic welfare and other needs. And politicians have a long history of incredible cynicism about this, a belief that publics are only really interested in hip pockets, that that this is not the real business of government, and there's no political advantage to be derived from actively pursuing these sort of agenda issues. I think that is a view that has to be contested and can be contested on the available evidence, and I spent quite a few pages in this drawing attention to a series of Lowy Institute surveys over the last years, which, not systematically unfortunately, but every one of those benchmarks issues has to a greater or lesser extent been addressed and surveyed, and it really is quite extraordinary the extent to which Australians are positively responsive to doing the right thing on really that whole range of issues, responding, by sending resources to deal with genocidal atrocities being, perpetrated in Africa or wherever. 70, 80, 90% of the population supportive of that, supportive of peacekeeping, supportive of all those other things. Aid is sometimes argued to be an exception. There's a lot of scepticism, and it's been based to some extent on a misreading of the opinion polls. There's a famous opinion poll, again a Lowy one, which was done in 2017, which was much quoted by the last government, which showed that something like 73% of the Australian population surveyed thought that we were spending too much money, or at best enough, and certainly shouldn't increase the amount we spent on aid. The following, which is quoted as saying, charity begins at home, and governments are justified, expenditure review committees are justified in using the razor. It's always the first to go, and that's the problem that I had in government, that Julie Bishop's had, that every foreign minister has had, fighting these battles. In 2018, Lowy decided to ask similar question, but to phrase it a different way. Whereas the previous year they'd given a figure, $3.8 billion, I think it was, and said, is this too little, too much, or about right? And got the response I've just described. The following year they said, no, let's do it differently. Let's not give a figure. Let's just ask people what percentage of the national budget you think is being spent on aid at the moment, and what do you think ought to be spent on foreign aid? And the results were extremely instructive. What people thought we were spending on aid at the moment was about 14% of the national budget, $14 in every 100. They said, no, and then, well, how much should we? Oh, no, that's too much. We should be spending about 10% of the national budget, $10 in every 100. What we were actually spending that year was 0.8%, 80 cents in every $100. So people thought we were spending 17.5 times as much as we actually were on aid, and thought we should be spending about 12 times as much as we were spending. And I think it's just a matter of how these questions are asked, what the knowledge base is, because there is an inherent decency in the Australian population. I don't think, maybe these issues will never win you elections, but I'm sure they don't lose elections. And I'm sure that there is something about a pitch to the Australian people made in terms of Australia as a decent country doing decent things which help people in distress elsewhere, even if there's no obvious return for us. This is the country we ought to be. I think that strikes a very resonant chord with Australians, and I'd like to see us being much more articulate about that, including the present government.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Now, over to you, Dominic. It's no small thing to ignite a process like this, to convene all these young people from around the country and to deliver this important strategy. The first question that comes to mind is, why did you believe this was so important? And then how did you bring it to life? Having heard from Professor Evans now, where do you see some of the alignment in the ideas put forward in his book?
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here and share some of our work. I also just want to probably say from the outset that in terms of convening all these people, I feel like my role was pretty much being a very out-of-time conductor for a very talented orchestra I was probably holding back. So the work that we've kind of put forward and that I'm lucky to be here and speak to today is really a result of the Herculean effort of an army of amazingly dedicated student volunteers from ANU, and obviously all of our 42 brilliant representatives who came from every state and territory and who toiled for months to put forward the strategy. In terms of kind of like why we thought this was really important, I think it kind of began with a sense that Australia's policy and planning approach, but also our kind of imagination and ambition were nowhere near meeting the scale and complexity of the challenges we face as a country, but also really as a species in many ways. We're being hit by all these cross-cutting challenges like climate change, the pandemic, that don't really respect the conceptual and institutional silos that we have set up and still live by. And so we saw the strategy as an opportunity to try and articulate the much more ambitious, multi-lever, whole-of-nation approach that we think is sorely needed. But I guess that kind of answers the question of why we thought, we needed a national security strategy, but not why a youth national security strategy specifically. And I think there are kind of two reasons why we thought it was essential that young people were the ones to write this. And the first was a quite pragmatic consideration, I suppose, that was really that young people genuinely have a lot to offer. We're an untapped resource in these conversations. And I think that flows from the fact that, we're very digitally fluent, we're very environmentally conscious, globally minded, generationally diverse. And I think all of those things shape a quite unique perspective that we have to bring to bear. And our kind of underlying belief that the Australian policy conversation will be impoverished so long as it went unheard. But I think there's also an important kind of intergenerational equity element of it, which is the kind of quite simple point that I think young people have a right to a seat at the table, which is deciding their future. And, so much of these policy conversations are about very significant long-term things that we should be part of solving. And so I suppose the Youth National Security Strategy was an attempt to fulfill that threefold mission. I'll spare you the saga of the whole story of how we brought it to life, but just in kind of quick summary, essentially what we tried to do was bring together an amazing brains trust of 42 young Australians who ended up representing every state and territory, dozens of disciplines, and they, through a kind of nearly stroke-inducing 6-month process, toiled away in, I think, about 60 different working groups in total, with the support of dozens of experts, and there they really kind of grappled from first principles with the threats and challenges that Australia faces and how we should be going about dealing with them. And to our delight and despair in equal measure, as organisers, they came back to us after this process with hundreds of pages of truly brilliant ideas policy proposals that we felt an obligation to do justice to. And so we then, in turn, they returned the favour, and then we had to toil away for months and try and collate and synthesise these into a strategy which you can find on our website. I think it basically just really speaks to a quite kind of powerful vision of how Australia can do much better in reshaping not only our defence, our development, our diplomacy, but also kind of better integrate them and coordinate how we pull these levers in ways that better equip us as a nation to grapple with these challenges. And in terms of the kind of alignment with Gareth's amazing book, I think the kind of strongest valence is how we too really make the case that living up to our values on the international stage will boomerang back to us in very practically rewarding ways. You know, like a just climate transition will be a faster one. A generous humanitarian program will prevent destabilization that might otherwise kind of come back to bite us and be more costly to fix later. A generous development program will see our neighbours flourish in ways that increase our opportunities to prosper together through trade and things like that. And also, I really like the quote from, I think it's Mariana Mazzucato, on why we should be generous in terms of health policy, which is that we will only ever be as healthy as our sickest neighbour. And I think that captures the logic that Gareth articulates so well, and that I think we too try to build on, about this kind of pragmatic idealism that I think is at the core of what we offer. And I think, those things are kind of a lovely synergy between our work, but also an almost like a bit of an intergenerational pincer attack on the kind of Canberra consensus. So, yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Dominic. Really insightful. Thenu, you were one of the leading participants in the strategy, and you also, as the CEO of Oaktree, amongst a number of other leadership roles, please tell us what drew you to this process and what you saw as the main themes that animated the group.
Such a great question. I have to say first, though, that Dom is so humble. We were all co-authors. We co-authored ideas, but Dom was really the one who put those 30,000 words from pen to paper. So really it was a huge effort by Dom and the team in getting us all together, a group of really diverse young people, not only from every state in Australia, every territory from Australia, but also different career paths. We had doctors, we had scientists, we had lawyers, development professionals and emerging security experts all in the same room together. And I have to say this was probably one of the main things that drew me to this process in the first place, just the sheer diversity and the voices that we were getting in the room. But I think anyone who works in development in this room would know that, we're always talking about being cautious about the securitization of aid and of development. So when I first heard about this, I do have to say I probably wasn't interested, but a really close mentor of mine, a shared mentor between Dom and I, we talked through it a little bit, and I had actually, talking about pragmatic idealism, actually, I had just read Samantha Power's biography, The Education of an Idealist. And I think I started to realise why it is so important for us as development and aid professionals to understand the emerging context we're working with and be really realistic about how we can further our goals through different elements of statecraft as well. And so learning more about this process, I think I realised that this was not just about a traditional concept of national security. It wasn't necessarily about the securitization of aid or development. Instead, it was actually reconceptualizing what security meant in itself. And to me, that was what was really, really exciting. And in terms of what the key themes were that came out in those original conversations, it's looking beyond defence, it's looking beyond traditional hard threats to things like social security, things like health security, looking at social welfare, understanding that housing affordability is probably one of the biggest security threats that we as young people will face in the next few years. And working with these 42 representatives it was a really exciting opportunity, I think, to put our brains trust together and really try to tackle some of these non-traditional threats.
Fantastic answer. Thank you so much, Thenu. Dominic, not unlike Professor Evans, with the strategy you state, there are strategic rewards for being a generous global citizen that we should, as per our values, strive to be anyway. How much weight did you place on values as a starting place in shaping the strategy?
Bigly, to use Donald Trump's favourite word. I think I'm glad you put out that quote, because I think it really encapsulates more than any other in the strategy, probably the way in which we, like Gareth, really began with a view of interests and values as really two sides of the same coin. I think they're often set up as this kind of binary trade-off, and we're almost told that the pursuit of raw interests is the kind of, security, prosperity is the true and virtuous business of statecraft, and values are just the kind of naive stories we tell that kind of cloud the hard heads we should have. But I think that binary unravels as false very quickly when you actually try and think about what our interests really are, try and really define them. And that's something that we really tried to do from first principles when we brought all these brilliant minds together. What do we mean by security? What do we mean by prosperity? And I think you find pretty quickly that when you work through those questions, it's our values that inescapably shape and give meaning to our interests. I'll kind of give you a quick example to illustrate that. I would say it's Australia's quite liberal values that explain why, we understand our security interests in terms of things like respect for international law. And why we understand our economic interests in terms of things like free and rules-based international trade and exchange. And, to flip that example, I think it's authoritarian values that can explain why some countries interpret their security interests in terms of regime survival, security from, not for their people. So hopefully that example kind of illustrates how when you actually really boil it down, it's values that shape and define interests. And so I think once we had kind of built that understanding, we really tried to kind of banish the pretense that there was such thing as values-free foreign policy. There really kind of is no such thing. It's not possible nor really desirable. And so we really tried to kind of wear our heart on our sleeve to anchor our values as a kind of free, open, liberal society as the kind of lodestar of our strategy. And I think the result is that the strategy, while always very kind of practical in its approach, aims to be not just a guide to surviving the world we're given, but to kind of thriving in the world we want and can try and help realize. And, for those of you who think that sounds naive, which may be to some extent, I would say that I think history kind of in many ways vindicates that kind of pragmatic realism. I mean, look at, the UN, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the WTO, the treaty that kind of closed the hole in the ozone layer. I think those are all, it's an imperfect system, but imagine how grim and dangerous the world would be if all the kind of idealist architects of those institutions had listened to all the kind of hard-headed foreign policy realists who told them that the world is kind of immutably cruel, So I think that's the kind of ethos that I think Gareth expresses so well and that really inspired us, and hopefully we carried through.
Wonderful. Professor Evans, you were one of the... Oh, sorry, Gareth. You were one of the main architects of the responsibility to protect doctrine. Both this book and this youth strategy argue for Australia going further on human rights.
Can I just say at the outset how impressed and encouraged I am to hear from both Thenu and Dom in the way in which you've articulated the enterprise in which you've been engaged, and this willingness to square the circle between idealism and realism, the concept of pragmatic idealism, is really the name of the game in the real world. And we've really screwed up policy quite often when we've gone too far in either direction. I mean, it's obvious easy to see a way in which we've screwed up by being excessively realist and indifferent to the value issues. But we've also screwed up in the other directions, often by making the best the enemy of the good. And I have to say to the Greens in the audience, I'll never forgive you for knocking, not those of you who represented you in the Senate, for knocking off Rudd's carbon CPRS because it wasn't good enough, and for knocking off the Malaysian solution on refugees because it wasn't good enough, and condemning us to very bad policy for a long while. So you've got to temper your idealism, your vision of the perfect with what is realistically achievable, and you can get a hell of a lot done when you walk both sides of the street. As the Jimmy Maxton, a Scottish Labour Party guy in the 1930s, expressed it beautifully, I think, when he once said, if you can't ride two bloody horses at once, you shouldn't be in the bloody circus. And I think that idealism and the realism are two sides of the same coin. And that's what you have to do, I think, in the promotion of human rights. By the way, when we talk about values, it's all very well to talk about Australian values to domestic Australian audiences, but for God's sake, don't talk about Australian values or Western values when we're talking internationally. That language is dead on arrival. Talk the language of universal values. And, the Australian values that we are applauding and trying to embody in the kind of strategies you're developing are, of course, universal values. And, that's just an important distinction. I can't get Penny Wong to accept this. She insists on talking about Australian values everywhere and driving me nuts. But anyway, that's we're working on it. But look, and human rights, this is the classic area where you've got to walk sort of both sides of the street. My mantra when I was Foreign Minister was you do that which is productive, obviously. You don't shrink from doing that which is unproductive, but worth the water on the stone principle. And thus I instructed my poor, often unhappy diplomats to make representations in country after country based on amnesty reports of imminent executions or political prisoners. I think 600 representations in 90 countries in 1 year alone. You do it even though you generate results only in a tiny handful of countries because you're conveying the message, at least to that country, that someone is out there watching, monitoring, noticing, and that can make an impact over time. But don't worry about doing that which is unproductive. Where you have to draw the line is doing that which is counterproductive. And it can be the case that some very active and visible human rights activity and advocacy can be counterproductive simply because it generates resistance from the powers that be in a way that doesn't help the very people you're trying to help. I mean, there's lots of examples I could give of this, maybe. But the one that really sticks in my memory, because East Timor was such a troubling issue for me and my government for so long, we were on the verge of persuading the Indonesians, and my very close relationship with Ali Alatas was instrumental in this, to accept an autonomy, not an independence, but an autonomy package for East Timor, which would involve getting the military out, getting development assistance in, getting cultural and language recognition, and generally, stabilising and dramatically improving a situation which had been terrible since 1975. We're on the verge of and Alatas told me, Suharto's about to announce this. That coincided with a big meeting of APEC in Indonesia. Bill Clinton, on the way to that meeting, made a speech in Jakarta in which he said, one of the things I'm going to be emphasising in my discussions with President Suharto is the absolute necessity to move down the path of autonomy for East Timor. Suharto said, that's off the table. I'm not going to be put in a position of humiliation and being succumbing to pressure of that kind. So, and there's individual cases of, representations about imminent executions and so on. Maybe the Jokowi case, the Chan Sugraman case is another example. I don't know, but you've got to be careful. Look, just very quickly on responsibility to protect. This is another largely Australian contribution to international thinking. It's the idea that there is in the case of responding to genocide, other major crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, there is a responsibility of the wider international community to do three things. First, not to allow those things to happen in your own country. Secondly, to assist other countries where they're in a mood to be assisted, to deal with internal stresses and pressures that are creating those atrocity situations. And third dimension of it is the responsibility of the wider international community to respond appropriately when prevention has failed and when major atrocity crimes are occurring. with, in the extreme case, military intervention, provided it's authorised by the Security Council. This was a response to the consensus-free zone, which you may remember existed in the 1990s, with the terrible series of atrocities that occurred in Rwanda, 1994, in Srebrenica, a year later, Kosovo again, a little later still. Over and over again, these terrible genocidal and other activities were occurring with the international community just deeply, deeply divided, no consensus. The global north talked the talk about humanitarian intervention, send in the Marines. The global south was not indifferent to the suffering that was concerned, but was utterly resistant to the idea that there was any right to intervene militarily by the big guys in these situations. They had too much imperial experience of civilising missions and the rest to buy that. So what we did was come up with this concept, changing the language of the debate. There wasn't a right to intervene, there was a responsibility to protect, which helped get international consensus, and to articulate a strategy which wasn't just about military intervention, was about prevention, was about other forms of... That's, it's not had a great record since Libya in 2011, Syria the same year and subsequently, and several in Sri Lanka in 2008, 2009, and more recently, of course, with Russia's abominable behaviour in Ukraine. So, you can say that the whole thing has been a complete bust and a waste of time. I've got a much more complex response to that. It's worked in terms of getting a new normative consensus out there, even if that's not always translated into practical reality, and that's evident in a series of UN resolutions and General Assembly debates. It's worked in terms of mobilising a lot of institutional preparedness to deal with this, including through the development of the international criminal justice system. It's worked very often preventively to defuse situations by mobilising diplomatic activity by the UN or regional organisations. And prevention, of course, when it succeeds, nothing happens, therefore nobody notices, therefore you never get any credit for it, but that's worked. Where it hasn't worked is in the area of effective response to really major atrocities actually occurring, and with the present environment in the international geopolitical scene and lack of any kind of consensus in the Security Council, it's a long haul back to get this concept. But to be attentive to the responsibility to protect is one of the real benchmarks, the human rights benchmarks of being a good international citizen. And you can certainly tell those countries around the world that take this obligation seriously from those who don't.
Thank you so much for that. Just finally a question. The Labor government, for Gareth and Thenu, the Labor government has recently launched a review of its overseas aid program. Many organisations, including Results, are calling for an increase in ODA, greater investment in global health and investment in women and girls as vital change agents in addressing climate change, conflict and global health. What do you both believe should be the main focus of a revitalised overseas aid program? Firstly, Thenu.
I did just write about a 5-page submission on this, but I'll keep it short. First of all, I think let's discuss ODA for starters. I think Gareth's already mentioned in that last chapter of his book that there is a public will for increased ODA and that we are inherently decent as citizens and want to be on the international stage. Yet, even though Labor has said that they are increasing their ODA spend, when you look at it in real terms, actually it's stagnant and decreasing at best when you take into account inflation as well as temporary measures. So really first, I think we need to have a conversation around, yes, applauding Labor for finally having a strategy after so many years, but also keeping them accountable to continuing this work and increasing our ODA to what we have pledged, which is 0.7. Even if that seems like quite a far reach, we need to continue to increase that. But then go further than quantity of aid and actually look at quality of aid as well. I think for too long we have neglected really key players in this space. One of the biggest things that I am an advocate for is localised development, ensuring that we aren't the ones going into countries and telling them what we think is best, but actually being led by local communities and actually just being a partner to shift resources more than anything, to really, in the end, make up for what is really a result of a largely colonial and post-colonial structure that we've created in this world. So that's my first thing, the localisation. But then secondly, I would be amiss to not mention the power of young people, given that we are talking about a youth national security strategy here.
Fantastic.
The government has highlighted that the Asia Pacific region is the area of focus that they will be focusing on. In this region, 50% of the population is under the age of 25. One of the key areas that matter to all young people through our research at Oaktree, but also clearly through the YNSS, is the climate crisis. And we need to ensure that that is at the heart of our development policy, and that we are using First Nations foreign policy as well as our understanding of how local grassroots organisations are working to really drive our strategy in that space. And then similarly, to really understand that we need to do better ourselves too, to hold some credibility. We, on the recent Climate Change Performance Index, ranked 58th, I believe, after China at 55 and India at 8th, I think. So I don't think we're doing as well as even we think sometimes. And to hold credibility in a space where we are advocating for human rights, we need to look at our own backyard first as well.
And a quick comment from Dominic maybe, and then just come finally to Gareth, if that's okay. Go for it.
Echo almost all of what Thenu said, but certainly in the development conversations that we had in the YNSS, it was abundantly clear that it's not simply a kind of act of charity, notwithstanding the kind of compelling moral case to be much more generous in these areas, but good development policy, to use a phrase from Gareth, redounds to our national interest, in very important ways, in a few senses. It can be very preventative of kind of downward turns that might otherwise, as we alluded earlier, become more costly to fix later. But they also kind of grow mutual opportunities, whether that's in terms of trade or all these other things. So it's basically to make the case, which I think the YNSS did quite well, about how aid is ultimately an incredibly strategic investment, as opposed to some kind of like outflowing costs that we should just see as on the negative side of the ledger. And it would be strategically negligent in many ways not to kind of yield the long-term fruits that kind of come from actually having a very high quantity and high quality, as Thenu said, aid program.
That's wonderful.
Region, yeah.
Thank you so much, Dominic. And finally, Gareth?
I can't tell you how encouraged I am by the articulate character of these younger generations. I slide into my dotage, even though I am still young enough to be US president. I'm just incredibly encouraged by the commitment and the values that you're articulating, the way you're doing it. So congratulations, and the country's in really good hands. I agree with everything that's been said. I think there's this. Sorry, that's my hearing aid shrieking. I'm serious about my decaying infrastructure. I think there's three things that have got to be done with the aid review. One is to increase the quantum, the amount. That's just a no-brainer. It's just indefensible for a country as rich as we are, 12th or 13th richest country in the world, to be spending the order of magnitude that we are. It's just indefensible, and we've got to increase it, whatever the budgetary constraints. And I think the government gets that and will move in that direction. Secondly, it's got to be properly operationalised in the way in which you deliver aid. It's one thing to to satisfy the hard heads and the realists by saying, with a lot of aid expenditure, it comes back through contractors and through educational suppliers and so on, and that's serving the national economic interest. And yes, that's an argument that can help. But really, at the end of the day, localisation is incredibly important. And you've got to remember what aid is about. It's for helping other people. It's not for helping us. That's the whole point of it. And the third thing is the subject areas. And here I would say that, and I think you've sort of semi-agreed this, there's a traditional view that aid should be only about poverty reduction. And of course, that should be the central primary objective, and creating a capacity to deal with it as well as dealing with it directly. But it should also be about good governance. It should also be, I think, about conflict and atrocity prevention strategies. And aid can play into, properly directed, properly spent, properly thought through, can play into those objectives as well, which in turn feed into effective poverty reduction strategies, because countries that are well governed and are conflict-free, countries that are that much more capable, obviously, of addressing the issues of inequality and poverty that are so striking. But it is important not to get too theological about aid just being about poverty and only poverty and everything else is a distraction. And that is a bit of an issue with some people in the aid community, but we might have a debate about that. But that's my view.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our panellists, and please join me in a round of applause.
Okay. American author Margaret Wheatley says most social change is shaped by a single traceable conversation. On behalf of the whole audience, I want to sincerely thank Gareth Evans, Thenu and Dominic for having this really important conversation tonight, one that I'm sure will help initiate the kind of social change and leadership that the times are demanding. For too long, the aid and development sector has felt we need to focus on national interest arguments in order to convince politicians to take action. But what your book shows us, Gareth, is that the national interest will flow if we also make the case for placing decency and human dignity right at the heart of our foreign affairs. The rising impacts of climate change, pandemics and inequality mean that young people are inheriting a deeply unknown future. This means their voice is more important than ever before. I want to thank sincerely Thenu and Dominic for encouraging us not just to think about how we address these issues, but calling for a quantum step up in our level of engagement on these issues. Never have the stakes been higher, and I want to thank our panel specifically for helping us really reimagine the solutions and the type of inspirational leadership required to achieve them. Thank you so much. We now formally move into the Results Leadership Awards ceremony. This won't take us too long. We'll be out having canapes and a glass of wine shortly. Firstly, a little bit about Results. Our mission is to end global poverty, and we partner with organisations all around the world to shape a future where everyone has access to healthcare, education and nutrition. The issue perhaps closest to our heart is TB. As many of you may know, over 1 million people every year still die of TB, including 600 children every single day. It's a core issue of justice. Todd, have we got the volume working in order to show the Voices for Change video? Okay, beautiful. We'll now show a video, thank you, about Results.
It's important to have advocates, but it's also important to have informed advocates, helping to marshal the resources to meet those who need help most.
Charity begins at home. Yes, that is true. Charity does begin at home. But can you imagine if people from different countries were not giving aid to other countries? The burden that would be there would be huge.
When you're hearing about these problems of poverty, you hear about children dying from undernutrition. But what people are missing is that there's also the solutions already existing. So if we've got these compelling problems on one hand and the solutions on the others, and yet they're not being connected, what's in the middle? What's missing ingredient? It's the will. And that's what Results provides. We learn how to be the voice, to speak to decision makers who have the power to provide that solution.
Democracies work best when their citizens are actively engaged. Results gives every citizen the opportunity to tell their government that they care about international development, about poverty, about Australia being a good international citizen.
Why did it need results? Very clear message. Governments need some direction. If citizens don't pay attention to what the government is doing, either government will not do anything or government will do wrong things.
Ministers' offices notice how many letters come in on a topic, and a relatively small number of letters can actually be quite influential because it's proving to them that there is a community interest in something.
There is no replacement for those of you who are in their constituencies to go in and say, this still matters to us.
We learn how to put our voice into the media so that we can inform others, so that they can raise their voice too. And so we provide that missing ingredient and connect the solution with the problem.
I've met with Results staff, volunteers and with their global partners, and I've seen firsthand the power of their work, not just raising millions of dollars, but making sure that that money is getting to where it's needed most. And we know that the COVID pandemic has pushed too many people, especially women and girls, into poverty around the world. And we need the work of community organisations, just like Results, to make sure that we get back on track.
From the US and Canada to the UK, Australia, Japan and beyond, we know how influential your advocacy is with decision makers.
Results is one of the most effective grassroots advocacy organisations I deal with here at Parliament House. Rather than just talking about global poverty and trying to do something about it, it focuses on important issues like dealing with TB, immunising children, malaria, education. And I think that helps to bring a real clarity to the problems and also helps politicians to understand the sorts of tailored solutions that are required.
I know from my own perspective it would be impossible for me to be able to continue to work at the level that I am in relation to tuberculosis without the support of Results.
I cannot think of any organisation more worthy than Results because they make us in public life think very carefully about how we should be helping those who need help most.
Who helped put that together as well, our former CEO who's in the audience tonight. We work with a number of political leaders right across the political spectrum. We work with corporates, we work with NGOs, and I think most essentially we work with a national network of advocates. And this year the following people and companies have been nominated as absolute standouts in their efforts to address global poverty. I'm going to start with the Political Leadership Award. The nominees are Kate Thwaites, MP, Dr. Mike Freelander, MP, Alicia Payne, MP, the Honourable Dr. Andrew Lee, MP, Senator Louise Pratt, Dr. Karina Garland, MP, the Honourable Michael McCormack, MP, and Senator Simon Birmingham. And the winner for tonight is Dr. Mike Freelander. Dr. Freelander is a paediatrician by training. He is a Labor MP for the seat of Macarthur and a long-standing member of the Australian TB Caucus, for which Results serves as the Secretariat. Dr. Freelander is receiving this award tonight for his decade-long interest and commitment to global health and his strong efforts to work with us specifically on the issue of TB. We have Results Ambassador Marie Nutt to present the award to Dr. Freelander, and you're welcome to say a few words. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. It's a great honour for me to be here today and really in some exalted company. Professor Evans really is a hallowed figure in the Labor Party and, I'm very proud to be here today with you and to hear what you've said. You have a record that's unsurpassed as Foreign Minister and I'm very proud to be part of a party that has had you as our Foreign Minister. I'd like to first of all acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to also acknowledge the Darrawal people of my own electorate of Macarthur and in particular our Aboriginal Medical Service, Darrawal Medical Service, with whom I've worked for over 30 years. I'm very proud to be part of the Labor Party, a Labor government that will bring an Indigenous voice to Parliament and have it enshrined in our Constitution. I'm proud to count Linda Burney and our other members of our Aboriginal caucus, including Pat Dodson, as ones that will carry that. I'm confident the Australian people will vote for that. I'm confident we will have that in this term of Parliament. I'm very grateful to receive this award, and the leaders that were on that group of nominees with me are all wonderful members of our parliament on both sides of politics, and there is clear consensus about this. It's great to receive this award almost to the day on the 50th anniversary of the Whitlam government. And Gough understood the importance of healthcare in having a functioning economy and a functioning nation. And that's why we got Medibank, our first universal health insurance scheme. And he understood the importance of health aid in terms of capacity building and exactly what you were talking about. It's not just about giving money to give aid, it's about capacity building. And I was very lucky to go with Professor David Cooper on a trip through Southeast Asia and Myanmar to look at how he, with the help of the Kirby Institute, had built health infrastructure in Southeast Asia. It was a tragedy that this, excuse me, that this was really destroyed in the last 10 years. And we have to go through the whole process now of rebuilding that in-country capacity. And that will take some time, and it will take commitment over the longer term. We must increase our aid budget. We must do better in health infrastructure, and that in turn not only benefits us, but it benefits the world. If we can have functioning healthcare, we are much more likely to have functioning economies and functioning countries. Tuberculosis is a particular interest of mine. My generation of doctors thought that we would see the end of TB, and in fact I have a textbook published in 1975 called The End of Plagues, where it was thought we would eventually see the total eradication of tuberculosis. It hasn't happened for a whole variety of reasons, but it is still something we should aspire to, and I think will eventually happen. I'm so grateful for this award. I'm very proud that you've given this to me, but I know that I'm in exalted company today, and in particular, our future does look pretty secure when you look at Dominic and Thenu. So it's really, really great to be here with you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Freelander. That was wonderful. Now moving on to our Media Leadership Awards. The nominees are Natalie Whiting of ABC News, Priyanka Srinivasan of ABC Pacific Beat, Claudia Farhart from SBS World News, and Matt Wade from the Sydney Morning Herald. And the winner is Priyanka Srinivasan from ABC Pacific Beat. Priyanka formerly worked in the Shepherd Islands in Vanuatu, where she learnt about the power of storytelling and the important role of radio in particular for remote Pacific Islanders. Her work and the work of Pacific Beat more broadly plays a vital role in deepening our engagement with the region. Congratulations, Priyanka, and we've got a video of Priyanka joining us from Melbourne.
Thank you so much for this award. It means a lot to be considered in any sort of way as a media leader. Certainly my work at Pacific Beat and telling the stories from the Pacific, about the Pacific, really is all thanks to this incredible team that I have with me at ABC. Really, a lot of my job is just bringing their stories to the air, and also bringing the stories of people in the Pacific who can talk the best about the issues affecting them. So thank you so much for the award, but really this is an award for everyone who's helped to get these important stories from the region to audiences around the region and also here in Australia.
Thank you, Priyanka. We're now moving on to our Corporate Leadership Award, and the nominees are Christie's Spaces, Kaijin, Inspira, and I think we've got Inspira in the room tonight. It's lovely to have you here, and Assura. And the winner tonight is Kaijin. Kaijin is strongly committed to the global fight to end TB, and over the last few years they have been fabulous partners with us at Results. I think Kaijin's commitment to ending TB runs deep. Last year they lit up their whole building in Melbourne red on World TB Day to really raise awareness of this devastating disease. We now have a word of thanks from Kaijin's CEO, who's in Boston.
Good day from Boston. My name is Thierry Bernard and I am the CEO of Kaijin. Together with our team in Australia, we are very proud at Kaijin to receive, together with our partner, Results International Australia, this Corporate Leadership Award for our common fight against tuberculosis. Fact number 1, tuberculosis is definitely still a killer. Every year, we see at least 10 more million cases of tuberculosis all over the world, of which at least 1 million per year will result in death. Fact number 2, TB is on the rise, and TB deaths are on the rise. In 2019, we registered 1.2 million deaths from tuberculosis. This number rose to 1.7 million in 2020. Fact number 3, the COVID-19 pandemic did really hurt the fight against tuberculosis because it drove many states all over the world to decrease their funding for the fight against tuberculosis. We now know in 2022 that only half of the funds committed to the fight against tuberculosis have actually been spent in the last 2 years. This situation is preventable. There are treatments, obviously, antibiotics treatments against tuberculosis. We need to make them accessible to more and more people all over the world, once again, especially in the emerging countries. Our objective is to leave no one behind. We need to continue to bring the affordability of latent TB tests all over the world. This is a commitment from QIAGEN. This is a significant weapon in the fight against tuberculosis. Thank you.
You can see, as you can see, their passion runs very deep for ending TB. I'd now like to ask Results Chair Ted Jontek to present the award to Arthur Siagalis, who's joined us tonight from Melbourne on behalf of QIAGEN. Congratulations, Arthur.
Thanks, everyone. A few passionate words from our CEO. Thierry's an amazing person, and the passion flows right down through the company. But one thing I think we need to all think about is the work that Nagaya and the team at Results really do. They do share a very, very similar passion to us, and they really do have something special and do something special on a day-to-day basis. So first, a round of applause to you guys, because without you... being nominated was a great acknowledgement, but the recognition of actually winning is just means so much to the team. For over a decade now, we've been a part of creating awareness about tuberculosis, prevention, testing, treating latent TB infection, to hopefully one day, as a few people have mentioned, is to end TB, global TB elimination. We are passionate. We'll continue to be passionate. We've been passionate for over a decade, hopefully for another couple of decades to come. And what better way to sort of reflect in those couple of decades and say, we were actually a part of eliminating one of the deadliest diseases in the world. So thank you, and thanks to everyone who's nominated.
As I think you can see from our video, so much of what makes Results impactful and a little bit special, I think, is our national network of advocates. Every year, people from all walks of life right throughout the country sign up to advocate on global poverty issues. And as you've also seen, they help achieve some rather extraordinary results. So let's now turn our focus to acknowledging Results advocates. I'm going to start with the award for extensive service. The nominees are Claire O'Brien, Bruno Contro Pretero, Kaliki Salazar, Graham Kerridge, Madeline Strawn, Monish Puri, and Gayatri Menon. And the winner tonight is Claire O'Brien. Claire has been an incredibly effective advocate on the issues of global health, During her time with us, she has rallied a number of volunteers to meet with federal parliamentarians and really set out a compelling case for investment specifically in the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB and malaria. As a result of her work and the work of other advocates and organisations throughout Australia, the Australian government recently announced a commitment of $266 million for the Global Fund. It was the highest contribution on record for Australia. I want to congratulate Claire, and we've got Claire, a video from Claire in Melbourne.
I am absolutely thrilled to be able to accept this award from Wurundjeri Land in Victoria. It's such a privilege to be able to receive this award. I know there were some exceptional nominations, and I feel so lucky to be in such great company. I want to say a massive thank you to everyone at Results, both advocates and also Results staff. Everyone has been extremely supportive since I joined Results. I've been able to reach out to so many people and just ask for advice, ask questions, and I've received guidance and support. I also want to say a huge shout out to my Victorian Lead Advocacy Group. We have some exceptional advocates in Victoria. I know I'm a little bit biased in saying that, but I just want to thank everyone for the time and effort that they put into advocating. And over 2022, we've been able to run some amazing events. We've been able to meet with multiple MPs, and I'm honestly really looking forward to what we can do in 2023. But I know that I would not have been able to lead such an amazing group and to achieve my own advocacy goals without the support of the advocates in Victoria.
Thank you so much, Claire. And now the award for advocate for less than 12 months. So these are advocates that have been with us a relatively short period of time. And the nominees for tonight are Muslima Halkano, Zachary Finch, Tahiri Anam, Turitsi Mujatan, Jasmine Wright, Adiri Wuri Otmojo, Olivia Norton, Andrea Neofito, and Rihab Waniki. And the winner tonight is Zachary Finch. Zach has been with Results only a short period of time, but has done an absolutely brilliant job of meeting with a number of federal MPs, including Shadow Foreign Minister Simon Birmingham. I was part of that meeting and I was incredibly impressed with Zach. He made a very compelling case again for investment in the Global Fund. Like Claire, Zach can feel proud that his advocacy helped achieve that really strong outcome of $266 million for the Global Fund. Congratulations, Zach. And we've got a video of Zach from Adelaide.
I just want to show how much I appreciate this award. I'm really, really thankful to the whole Results team that I've gotten the awesome opportunity to work with this year, especially Jawoon, who led the Results Fellowship Program. She is so inspiring and encouraging and has made my life a lot better, and I feel like I've grown a lot as a person because of getting to work with her. I am really, really excited to hear about the future of Results work next year and into the future as we continue to fight poverty. Everyone, all the other fellows, really appreciated being able to work with you, getting to meet you. You guys were awesome. And I just wanted to end with this quote from William Penn, which is that right is right, even if everyone is against it, and wrong is wrong, even if everyone is for it. And I'm just excited to hear about Results work in the future for justice. Thank you.
There's some incredible young people coming through the ranks, which, as Gareth said, leads us all, I think, really hopeful for the future. Finally, before we wrap up for tonight, we have someone very special in the room who deserves some recognition. Sarah Meredith was the country director and then became the regional director of Global Citizen. Global Citizen, as many of you would know, is an international advocacy organisation with a shared mission to end global poverty. After 7 pretty remarkable years, Sarah's decided to move into a new chapter of her life, and we really wanted to acknowledge her extraordinary leadership, her vision, and her absolute determination to shift the dial on these really important issues. Sarah, you've been exceptional. I'm personally going to miss working with you. And we just wanted to really acknowledge you tonight. So we've got a little gift.
Well, this is completely unexpected, but it's very hard working in the international development sector. We go out and we fight every day on a topic that's not as popular as other issues. But to have colleagues like Nagaya and Marie in the early days, and Thenu as well, I work very closely with Thenu, has meant the world to me because they're the friends and allies that help us get on every day. And we do work very closely with results on our World Polio Day, and it's one of my proudest achievements, the commitments we've received for polio, and I'll always be cheering you guys on. But thank you.
Okay, a final few words to close the evening. I want to start by thanking our wonderful sponsors who have provided the venue tonight, Colin Biggers and Paisley. Thank you to Results Director, who I know is watching live online from Adelaide, Ryan Turnbull, for donating the wine. Thank you to our wonderful staff for creating a really successful night. I'm deeply appreciative. So much work goes into an event like this. I really want to acknowledge each and every one of you. Thank you to our fabulous MC, Nicole Clements, and of course our panellists, Gareth, Thenu and Dominic. Thank you so much. And to all of you, our guests, both here in Sydney and online, have a wonderful evening and thank you.